Okay, let me welcome everyone here today. A special guest here who is now based in Berlin, in exile in Berlin. He had been Denis Stalin, who's right here. He had been a professor at St. Petersburg State University in Russia. He, unlike a lot of professors at Russian universities, believed it was more important to tell the truth than simply to conform and to defer to the aggressive, the militaristic ideology that has taken hold in Russia. And so he, among other things, spoke truthfully to his students about the war. And you can see online, there's a very good video of his final lecture to his students. They gave him a standing ovation, which I was pleased to see. However, he was fired and is now a scholar in exile at the Institute for Contemporary History in Berlin. And I'm very pleased to have him here. I hosted a talk with him in the spring. That was done by Zoom because he didn't yet have his US visa. So in that case, he spoke about the war and the situation in Russia. Today, he'll be speaking about one of his areas of expertise, which is the study of the Great Terror under Stalin through the use of archival photographs and family photographs that people have gathered and he's been able to obtain, and what they reveal about the Great Terror. So with that, please, and I should add, he had published a book that came out in both Russian and English translations.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Kramer for inviting me here. I'm very honored to have the opportunity to be here and to share with you my research that I started more than 10 years ago. Stalin's rule was accompanied by unprecedented political terror. Millions of innocent Soviet citizens proclaimed enemy of the people were shot or died in camps. But not everybody knows that almost all representations of people declared enemies, including photographs, were destroyed or edited. As argued in David King's book, The Commissar Vanishes, the falsification of photographs and art in Stalin's Russia, which shows manipulated and partly destroyed photographs of executed old Bolsheviks and Soviet high officials. The falsification of photographs and works of art was part of a broader trend of falsifying history in Stalin's Soviet Union. This is a very important book, for sure. In most cases, however, the editing of a photograph had nothing to do with intentional falsification or censorship, and it was practiced in private. As I have attempted to demonstrate in my book, Defacing the Enemy, the majority of photographs were destroyed by those who were part of the victim's intimate circle, his or her colleagues, friends, or even close family members. These manipulations remain almost undocumented, apart from the edited photographs themselves and extremely rare accounts by some memoirists. Unlike David King's book, focusing on photographs of prominent Bolsheviks, Stalin, and his close associates, my book focused on family photographs showing ordinary citizens and explored motives behind the editing. While the way in which unwanted representations of portraits were eliminated was always different, one can still distinguish a few of the most common modes of editing. Often, the one who tampered with a photo blacked several zones out with ink, as in the portrait of Flying Club graduates here. In the college, in the spirit of late constructivism, showing the first Congress of road builders, or in another photo, which represents honorary workers of an important building, or, in other words, a crew of senior officials members of the tutorship council of the building. The name of the deleted person is also obliterated, destroyed. This photograph is remarkable in that it allows one to see not only the way of eliminating the enemy, but also the scale of purges among high party officials. The portraits of 6 out of 10 party functionaries are blacked out, and at least one person ought to be added to this number. Alexei Grachev, top row, far right, this person, served as a chairman of the Council of Gorky City. Although Grachev was a member of the extrajudicial troikas, passing sentences under political articles, this didn't save him from arrest and execution in 1938. In other cases, the attempted attack upon a photograph assumed a more localized expression, being focused on the public enemy's face, like in this photo or in this one, or yeah. Figure 8 was defaced in a state of extreme excitement, judging by the swirling nervous marks of the pen. In addition, the attack is focused on the enemy's face, in contrast with more neutral breaking out of the whole figure of the enemy or the whole segments of the photo. Covering the enemy's figure with a layer of black paint can be considered a quite neutral way of removal, and in this respect comes close to the covering of the unwanted representation with a piece of white paper, like one can see in this figure, or to the removal of the dangerous part of the photo. Crossing out public enemies' faces was, in Stalin's era, another less radical method of their symbolic execution. One can see this in the next photo. 30 years later, in the 1960s, during political rehabilitation, 2 cross-shaped lines in the face of 2 persons at the center of the photo, Nikolai Uglanov and Ivan Chugurin, were erased. This manipulation is easy to see if the central part of the photo is enlarged. The restoration of an intentionally damaged picture was not rare in the post-Stalinist era. As one can see in the photograph depicting the writer Maxim Gorky with an officer, the representation of the officer was cut out, but then this part of the snapshot was glued back into its initial place. You can see it in this photo. On another copy of this photograph, the officer is defaced. Sometimes the enemy's representation was excised, like here, or in this photograph, or here, or here, or scratched out, like here. This photograph and this one show a group of officers. Yeah, so repressions among officers were very important. You can see this in these photos. Then this photo. Then there are photos like this one, which were excised with scissors after having been blacked out with ink. Even now, one can see on the left and right some remnants of black ink. If the owner of the photograph, it is the owner of the photograph who chose the form of editing, and it was his political and moral position that defined his choice. So figures 22 and 23 belonged to different people who chose different forms of removal of enemies. Moreover, in the second case, the author deleted the arrested person's portraits twice by inking and blacking them out. Because the difference between the forms of the enemy's elimination is also important, I will return to this discourse later. What made people destroy photos of their acquaintances or loved ones? I would like to argue that the answer to this question can be found in the performative value of portrait photography. Photography marks the depicted person's transition from an old personality to a new one, a demolition of the person's former self, followed by a rebirth in a new role. Pertaining to a group snapshot, it sacralizes one's appearance as a member of a group, being a certificate of friendship for those whom this photo depicts. When one appears in a group photograph, in other words, when a threshold is crossed, that person is considered to be a part of the group. From this moment, it is difficult to separate oneself from this group, to retrace the person's steps, to reverse the path that has already been traveled. Now, the individual's life is associated with the life and destiny of the group. For this reason, the group photograph itself was automatically viewed by the NKVD as a conspiracy scheme and often functioned as an equivalent to the diagram of Trotsky plot or spy organization that the NKVD agents used to include in the investigatory dossiers. Like a diagram, a group photograph is a visual representation of a group, allowing the observer to examine its social structure and relationships between its members. Second, the conspiracy itself constitutes a network structure, exactly as the characters of a group, exactly as the characters of a group photographs are supposed to do. The conspirators share their beliefs. They demonstrate the absolute unity of their political convictions and goals. Stalinist society being paranoidly suspicious towards all informal groups and organizations, a group of friends automatically changed into a community of conspirators if one of the depicted people turned out to be an enemy of the people. Under such circumstances, a group photograph can also be used for testing a suspect, who can always change sides, separate from the public enemy and sever a friendship made with one. The suspect needs to make a choice that allows for a small space to maneuver. Either she separates him or herself from the public enemy, renounces and forsakes him or her, or shares his or her destiny. The only way to cleanse oneself from unwanted proximity is through the destruction of the dangerous picture or neutralization of the enemy's portrait in the photograph. By destroying the enemy's representation, the suspect excludes him or her from the community, so that the enemy's crimes are not conflated with the suspect enemy. This renunciation of an enemy goes hand in hand with an initiation. By destroying his or her former friend's image, the individual compulsorily shares the persecutor's crimes, becomes one of them, and joins their community against his or her will. Some edited photographs document this collapse of friendship. A snapshot from the Memorial Society archives that used to depict a group of two friends was edited after one of them was arrested. The only remaining portrait is that of Stepan Karmanov, deputy head of the direction for military building of the Red Army. Like his eliminated friend, Karmanov himself did not escape repressions and was sentenced to death for negligence by a military court in 1941. The next photograph, taken in 1928, shows a large group of friends that initially included two families with children. At that moment, both families were in exile in the town of Minusинsk. The representation of the family in the upper row, Nina Delibash and presumably her husband, the economist Alexander Yosilevich, was eliminated. The only preserved portrait from this family is that of their small daughter, Lisa Delibash. No doubt, the removal of the portraits was politically motivated. Already in a labor camp, Alexander Yosilevich was arrested again and shot in May 1937. His wife, Nina Delibash, was arrested with her husband and shot in November 1937. The fate of the second family, whose representation still remains in the photograph, is equally tragic. After having returned from exile, the party leader Ivor Smilga was arrested again as a Trotskyist in 1935 and executed in 1937. His daughters, Tanya and Natasha, were arrested as soon as they were 18 years old and sent to the camp as family members of the enemy of the people. It was very common in Stalin's era. Tanya and Natasha were rehabilitated and returned to Moscow only in 1955, when the first was 36 and the second 34 years old. So the assumption that the defacer tried to destroy evidence of any involvement with the enemy of the people can be only partially true. This explanation is limited to formal and superficial aspects of the extirpator's behavior, without taking into consideration its deep psychological and political implications. The threatened people did not only try to get rid of the dangerous evidence, erasing all empirical, material traces of involvement with the enemy, but they also made a political choice, committing an act of political self-determination. These people acquired a new, politically clean identity. The family members of people arrested for political reasons faced a moral dilemma: to destroy the image of their loved one or to keep his or her photograph despite the risk of being persecuted for this. In some cases, the relatives of the arrested enemy couldn't cope with the psychological pressure. The four family photographs that I'm going to show are of great interest. The first one represents, it used to represent a husband and wife. During Stalin's purges, the representation of the husband, Mikhail Straikov, was cut out by his wife, Yelena. We have detailed information about the Straikov, which is rarely the case. In 1927, Mikhail was arrested based on denunciation. According to the informer, the student Straikov supported the right-wing opposition and distributed leaflets criticizing collectivization. However, he was released thanks to the petition of his supervisor and continued his studies at the university. But in 1938, Mikhail was arrested again, convicted by an extrajudicial troika under Article 58 and shot. In contrast, we know nothing about the next photograph, which is kept in the Memorial Society archives, among other anonymous images. However, this photograph is probably one of the most interesting among those available to us. This photograph photograph represents a group of close relatives. It's obvious. Yeah. The questions are, what kind of relationship is there between the represented persons? Who blacked the photograph out? This photograph strikes the observer with the violent manner in which the officer's face was attacked. The next photograph was displayed in a museum exposition in Tomsk as anonymous, until recently having been recognized by a visitor who identified one of the girls as her mother, Nina Kiselova, born in 1918. The woman was able to confirm her identity and, at the daughter's request, wrote memoirs recounting the story of her family. Nina's father, depicted in this photo, Vasily Litvinov, who was a caremaster in the city of Tomsk, resigned from his position as a priest after the revolution and earned a living as an instrumental and vocal music teacher. All traces of religion were erased from the life of his family. In spite of this, he was arrested and shot in 1937. Educated in the Soviet tradition, Nina was a devoted member of the Youth Communist League Komsomol. According to the hypothesis drawn by the archivists of the Tomsk Museum, it was Nina who cut out with a blade her father's representation from the rest of the photograph. This demonstrative cut was intended to symbolize the break of the communist daughter with her father, an enemy of the people. This cut constitutes a front line between friends and enemies running through the family. Nevertheless, it is important that despite everything, the girl did not destroy her father's portrait. She kept the detached part of the image. Although the next photograph suffered an attack during an earlier period than the previous images and under different circumstances, it can be categorized in the same group. Removed by the rest of the family, the eliminated part of the image showed a family member who took an active part in the collectization on the Soviet side, whereas the family itself was branded as kulak. Kulak means small private farm owner, deprived of property and exiled. So the family was deprived of property and exiled. The reason behind this attack were the same as in the cases analyzed previously, with the only difference being that the eliminated representation was of a communist apostate who betrayed family interests in favor of political motives. During the Civil War, regardless of the ideology, both sides used similar means of establishing boundaries between insiders and outsiders. The front line passed through the family and, of course, through the photograph, which constituted an ideal family body, so to speak. The choice of how to edit the photograph was of great importance, of course. We can observe some cases when an individual, realizing he or she was threatened and facing a painful moral dilemma, wanted to find a compromise between his or her security and his or her good faith. In this case, the iconoclastic act is barely perceptible, being committed in a purely symbolic way. That compromise is what we can see in the next photograph representing a group of communist delegates with Stalin, where 8 faces out of 30 bear barely visible cross-shaped traces left by a pencil. It is doubtful, however, that this compromise would have been effective. It was a defensive strategy applied against a system of control in which the goal was exactly to exclude all compromise and all neutrality, to nip in the bud all attempts of passive resistance. In Stalin's era, any neutrality could be revealed as a disguise, a pretense used by the enemies wishing to escape, to avoid punishment. Here, the suspect tried to find a way around the test to avoid it, as if she did not realize what the authorities expected from them. However, the insufficiency of punishment inflicted upon the image of an enemy could turn against the punishing person. Partly defacing, i.e. not blacking the enemy's face out completely, resulted in the suspect continuing to be present in a photograph with the enemy, belonging to the same group and thus sharing the enemy's crimes. All maneuvers to avoid renunciation were doomed to fail. Sometimes the enemy's relatives tried to keep a photograph of that person, thereby keeping emotional and affective relationships with a person labeled an enemy, while also attempting to avoid the danger resulting from keeping the photograph. Although this figure and the next one look different, both were developed from the same negative. The difference between these two photographs is that in figure 32, the general Fyodor Maksheyev is shown wearing its Tsarist army uniform, and in the other, his uniform is blacked out by his family members. Here. Two following snapshots also show a Tsarist officer. Here, the family members limited themselves to inking over only the Tsarist symbols, namely the officer's epaulets and his order in the shape of a cross. The rest of the uniform is preserved. Figure 36, the next one, belongs to the same category and, like the previous photographs, went through a political cleansing. The relatives of the person in the photograph, the Tsarist army officer represented in his uniform, cut away the lower part of the picture, keeping only the more precious upper part with the face. If one didn't want to get rid of an especially their photograph, then the image had to undergo surgery to be purified of all enemy elements in it. Once again, this cut constituted a kind of front line passing across the image. The practice that can be compared with editing photographs is self-criticism. If in the Soviet Union, if you reject substantialism and argue that political subjectivity is constantly shaped and reshaped, we must go further and say that the front line separating friend and enemy can go across the individual. As a result, the suspicion of a citizen could fall on part of the self. All people had to be vigilant, staying alert to the possibility of subversive ideas in their own class consciousness. Good communist citizens should be wary of themselves, making it impossible for subversive ideas to enter the mind unexpectedly or subliminally. In addition to renouncing others, Soviet citizens of Stalin's era had to constantly renounce themselves to distinguish and eliminate rightist or Trotskyite elements in their class consciousness. a communist, struggled against subversion, which attacked the person from the inside, using weapons such as introspection and self-criticism. Self-criticism should be considered an act of, in my opinion, an act of self-renunciation, and that is the key to understanding the importance of the public confession procedure under Stalin. Denouncing subversive elements in himself and renouncing them is, for an individual, a way to purify himself politically and to take a position on the right side of the political front. If its intransigence increased, self-criticism could change into an inner war with oneself. The dividing line between the narrator's former and actual personalities appeared as a front line. The individuals who practiced self-criticism declared war on their past and the corrupted part of themselves. The autobiographers drew the front line between their former self, which was presented as a corrupted and even enemy self, the enemy within oneself, and their actual, entirely loyal communist personality. Stalin's secret police officers were also aware that appearing with someone in the same photograph implied belonging to the same political community. Some group photographs depicting members of the Tsarist administration ended up in the hands of Stalin's secret police. These photographs became part of an NKVD card index and were used to find and arrest unreliable citizens. The first photo, this one, represents a group of rich merchants, members of the tutorial board of a vocational school in Nizhny Novgorod. We see in this photo Arabs and inscriptions giving us information about some of the represented persons, their name, their position under the old regime, etc. According to the inscriptions, 4 merchants were dead by that time, so we can read these inscriptions very well. Yeah? However, the investigators, Stalin's investigators, were interested not only in the people in the photograph, but also in their families. According to the commentary in the margin, the guild leader Naumov's children live in Nizhny Novgorod, and his son works at the factory number 80. 3 other photos were this one were also taken before the Russian Revolution and represent Tsarist police officers. It is apparent from the handwriting and the different colors of the ink in the inscriptions that this photograph passed through the hands of 2 NKVD investigators. On this basis, I make the hypothesis that the photograph was used by Soviet secret police twice. After the revolution, around 1921, inscriptions in black ink, and then in the early 1930s, during the era of Stalin's terror, inscriptions in blue ink. The individual, it's an enlarged it's fragment of the photo. The individual with the most detailed information is Grigory Lazarev, standing in the upper row, 3rd from the right, this person. An inscription in black ink points out that in 1905, the murder of the Bolshevik Aboshnikov, whose mother and brothers still live in Nizhny Novgorod, was attributed to Lazarev. As for Lazarev himself, at the moment when the inscription was made, he also resides in Nizhny Novgorod and is the head of the Criminal Investigation Department. Judging by the available sources, Grigory Lazarev did not have any political convictions. He was distinguished by unviable energy and made a good career in the Tsarist police. Soon after the revolution, he was arrested by the local Cheka, imprisoned in a concentration camp, and then released. After his release, Lazarev participated in the creation of the Soviet Criminal Investigation Department and Police. In Soviet times, he was quickly promoted, becoming, in 1920, the head of the Criminal Investigation Department of Nizhny Novgorod. However, his fate was sealed shortly after this photograph came to the attention of the Soviet secret police. In 1921, he was accused of corruption and shot. According to the historians who studied his criminal case, the accusation of bribery was only a pretext for the murder of the former policeman. Ivan Fedotov, the person sitting in the armchair far left, this person, was arrested after this photograph was used by the secret police for the second time in the 1930s. A father of 7 children, Fedotov was a police officer in Moscow and then in Nizhny Novgorod. After the revolution, he served as an assistant to the chief of police, clerk, and accountant. Arrested in 1937, he was sentenced to death by a troika and shot in 1938. At that time, he was 77 years old. The next photograph shows a group of district police chiefs of the Nizhny Novgorod region. This photograph bears many handwritten comments about the depicted persons, but the most curious and tragic is the face of Konstantin Vukolov, standing second in the right, this person. I know. I'm sorry, excuse me. This person, yeah, this person. One of the inscriptions informs us that Vukolov, police chief of the Balakna district, responsible for putting down the uprising in Sormola, has been executed. So we can read it here. Yeah, 2 other photos from this series. This photograph is a collage of portraits of judges, and the inscriptions indicate their place of residence. Inscriptions made by the NKVD offices. Moscow, Nizhny Novgorod, Stalingrad, or abroad. You can read it. Of course, Stalinist terror was directed not only at ordinary citizens. A huge number of Stalin's secret police officers themselves, including the immediate agents of the terror, were subsequently arrested and shot. Their portraits were also removed from photographs by their former colleagues or family members. I'm not a historian, but I worked a lot on the Soviet history of Stalin's period. So one can distinguish at least 3 generations of operational workers that succeeded each other during approximately 4 decades following the creation of the Soviet secret police Cheka. 4 generations of secret police officers, at least 3, maybe 4. A group belonging to the first generation of Chekists is represented in this photograph, showing Felix Dzerzhinsky, the first director of the Cheka, with his collaborators. The photograph was edited in the 1930s during self-repressions inside the secret police. The photograph from the International Memorial Archives depicts three officers belonging to the second generation of Chekists that was in power during Minzhinsky and Yagoda's directorship of the secret police. Taken in the 1930s, this snapshot is included in an album presented as a keepsake by the staff to Timothy Nazarov, the head of the Rhodes School of the Security Guards of the Western Railway. After two of the secret police officers were arrested, someone tried to destroy the picture with a razor. The character on the left, presumably the owner of the album, Nazarov, who was not subject to repression by that time, has been preserved. Nazarov was arrested later in 1937 and executed in 1938. Two other edited photos showing NKVD officers. I'm not going to speak about them. Okay. After the destitution and arrest of Nikolai Yezhov, the next NKVD director after Yagoda, all representations of him circulating in the public sphere were purged. Yezhov's photographs kept in private and semi-private albums were edited as well, like this photograph. An example of such a photograph is one from an album in a private collection in Nizhny Novgorod. This album with portraits of Soviet leaders was published shortly before the fall of Yezhov. The preserved copy of this snapshot demonstrates that this photograph initially showed Yezhov in the company of Stalin and Voroshilov. In this photograph, Yezhov's face is also scratched. You can see it. You can't see it very well, but the face is scratched a little bit. A photograph with the high OGPU. OGPU is another name for Cheka and NKVD. But it's the same secret police. A photograph with the high OGPU officer Leonid Zakovsky, far left, this person. So Zakovsky, who was well known for his cruelty and use of torture. This photograph was taken in 1936. An orphan of his father at the age of 4, then expelled from school, Zakovsky had been left under the influence of his older brother, an anarchist. It's quite a typical biography of a secret police officer under Stalin. All of them had problems, and all of them had a very modest social background. Yagoda's man, Zakovsky, successfully survived Yagoda as the head of the secret police and even participated in his destitution. Nevertheless, Zakovsky didn't manage to escape the inner purge in the NKVD ranks after Yezhov's fall. He was arrested and shot in 1938, soon after his chief Yezhov was removed from his position. The last chief of Stalin's secret police, Lavrentiy Beria, was accused of high treason and arrested in June 1933 after Stalin's death. Like his predecessor, Yezhov, Beria was surrounded by a developed personality cult. His exploits were celebrated in numerous songs and poems. His portraits were published with millions of copies in newspapers and books. And after his arrest, all representations of him had to disappear. Yeah, I think my time is over and I stop here. So if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer.
I have a few questions I'd like to start with, and then I'll open it up for other comments or questions. I'm reminded about the Great Soviet Encyclopedia that had an article on Beria, and subscribers to the encyclopedia suddenly, I think in 1954, maybe even as early as 1953, received an article on the Bering Straits. They were supposed to paste in place of it. Do you know, in some of these cases, why were they blacking these out instead of just discarding them, tossing them away or burning them? Because many of these, presumably, I mean, the markings in a lot of these cases that you've shown, were so crude that it is still fairly obvious who some of the people were. So I'm wondering, why didn't they just discard the photos? I'm told that, or at least I recall, I don't remember where this came. There's some report on how many people actually pasted in that article about the Bering Straits, and a very large number did. So I'm wondering here, too, it's where people are participating affirmatively in their own subjugation. And but it would seem to me that they'd be better, if they want to do that, they'd be better off just getting rid of the photos. There is also the case where divorced couples, say, in any country or in any normal country, you find that, especially if they have a bitter divorce, there'll be photographs that they have in which they want to get rid of that person they've just gotten divorced from. And in this case, have you looked, I mean, again, it's hard to do because these people, all of the people are dead, but have you looked, did they genuinely believe that their relatives or their friends or associates were guilty of what they were accused of, or were they just, was it just a case of self-preservation? Or did they genuinely come to hate that person the way some divorced couples come to hate each other, want to black out any images they have of that person? And then when you mentioned about the way some of these were blacked out, that there were, some were crude, but others they cut out the images. You suggested that there was some rationale for that people who wanted to cut out something maybe still wanted to preserve that photograph, but without that person, versus the people who crossed them out. It wasn't clear to me exactly why they would choose one or the other. So anyway.
Yeah. As for the first question, indeed, it's a very good question. Indeed, why not to get rid of a dangerous photograph or an object completely? My answer to this question is the following. In case of a family photograph, in case of a photograph showing your family member, your father or mother, it's very complicated to get rid of this photograph. And if, for example, it turned out that in your family album, there is a photograph showing your father and a person declared enemy of the people. So maybe it would be better to keep the photograph of your father and to destroy the photograph of the enemy of the people. So Many photographs, in my opinion, were preserved for this reason. So people didn't want to get rid of the photos showing their family members. And in other cases, when photos were edited by, for example, I don't know, a school teacher, because in Russia, even now, each school or each university has a museum devoted to the history of this school or this university. So, and as a rule, the directors of this museum are just teachers or just ordinary people. Yeah, and if you are responsible for an archive, how to destroy a piece from this archive? You will be punished. You have not tried to get rid of a photograph belonging to your institution. In this case, editing this photograph, cleansing this photograph is a good solution. So it's my response to the question why people did not destroy the photographs completely. The second question was about what people who edited photographs really thought about those depicted in this photograph. So did they believe that people declared enemy were really guilty? I worked on archives on some cases. It was always very complicated for the family member of the person declared enemy of the people, because children were educated in the communist tradition. They attended communist school. They shared communist ideology in a sense. And for many of them, the arrest of their father, for example, and the fact that this father had been declared enemy of the people was a great shock. And they couldn't cope with it. They were crushed, really crushed. And they often were writing letters to their arrested father, asking him this question: are you really guilty? Father, are you really guilty? And for the father, it was again a very complicated situation, because if you are declared enemy of the people, your family will be punished as well. Yeah, because Stalin's government introduced a series of measures directed against the family member of the arrested enemies. So if your father is declared enemy, it is very likely that you will not be admitted at the university. It is very likely even that you will be sent somewhere in exile. Yeah, so, but you have also a chance to renounce your father. Yeah, you have always a chance to say that I knew nothing about my father's crime, and I stand with the Soviet society, and I break all family ties with my father, who is not my father anymore. In this case, you will not be punished. And many parents who knew that their children would be punished for them, they preferred them to renounce them, and they wrote them the letters saying that, yes, I'm guilty. And so it's very tragic, in fact. It's very, very tragic. And there were also communists who understood very well what was happening under Stalin. And I think they also chose these compromise ways of editing. It means they tried not to destroy the photos of their acquaintances or friends declared enemy completely. Yeah. So they chose a more delicate form of editing. You know, one thing is attacking the enemy's face with colored ink. It's very violent, it's very aggressive. If you do this, it's very likely you believe this person is an enemy. You punish this person. It's a form of punishment. You know, it's very violent. Another thing is just to black the representation of the enemy out with ink. Inking is much, with black ink is much less aggressive and violent than attack on the enemy's face. Yeah. If you cross the enemy's representation, it's also much less violent than attacking the enemy's face. So, and the form of editing depends upon what you think about this person. It depends upon your real attitude towards this person. That's why the NKVD officers could use the photos as a test to test the suspect.
Do you know of instances in which people, the NKVD would come back to them and they would present the photos with the defaced figures to show that they were loyal Soviet citizens, or that is true to Stalin, or did they try to keep these photographs secret or hidden? But were there instances in which they brought out the photographs to show, see, we renounce these enemies of the people?
No, I never came across such documents, but I came across documents, came across interrogation reports where NKVD people asked a girl why she hadn't get rid of her father's portrait. So why they were asking her why she was keeping this portrait, the portrait of the enemy of the people. So it was dangerous.
I have to say this is a depressing subject. Please, over here.
Alexander was about here, and I'm working on the survivors photography. I have a couple of questions. Thank you, first of all, for agreeing to talk. You mainly talked about exclusion of persons and faces. How about you partially touched upon exclusion of signs when the person's costume attire was blacked out? How about certain motifs in the photographs and not persons which were excluded, or maybe views, buildings, churches, or other signs, symbols, national symbols? Also, some of the photos were scratched and some were just completely cut out. These were, I believe, done for completely different reasons, because when you choose to scratch, you still preserve the image and it expresses probably some sort of anger, but you still you keep the face of this person. So what were the reasons? Were the reasons different for these exclusions? And also my last question: what about the photographs? You talked about personal archives and family photographs, familial photographs. What about the photographs published in the public spaces like newspapers, which were preserved in the archives? In terms of censorship, these somehow taking care of, or maybe the access to them will always. And just last question, more practical. A couple of photographs had xerophobia or not. What does this mean, and how can we verify xerophobia on photograph? Thanks.
Yeah, okay. So exclusion of signs. Yeah, indeed, it's a very interesting problem in itself, and it was also, it was dangerous to keep, there was a category of objects that Soviet citizens were afraid to keep home of, yeah, and that the Soviet citizens tried to get rid of, like it includes all documents or objects bearing Tsar symbols, like yeah, and it was simply dangerous to keep these objects home. If the secret police comes to you, so you will be in danger. Yeah, and of course, people try to get rid of all these objects. And so, like in today's Russia, you know, if you keep books mentioning Soros Foundation, it's not good. Well, and but I'm primarily interested in editing photos and in removing such symbols from the photos, because in my opinion, this removal is a form of political purification. So if you want to keep a photo, you should make it less dangerous, and removal of such signs helps. It can, not sure, but probably it can help. So, another question was about editing newspaper photographs. In fact, in my research, I was primarily interested in family archives and family photographs. So there are really few photographs in my book originating from newspapers. My research was about private photographs. Yeah. My research was about family, and my research was about psychology. Yeah, because very often Stalinism is associated with its repressive system, with Gulag Archipelago. But in fact, Stalinism is awful just because it empties your personality, yeah, because it reshapes you. It kills your inner self and put there something that is not you, you know. Stalinism is not something which is external to you. No, Stalinism is in you. Stalinism can occupy place in your inner self. That's all. Stalinism can structure you. Stalinism can kill you and make you another person. And so censorship, I argue in my book that the editing I'm speaking about was not censorship. Yeah, it was not, this editing was not made by professional censors, by officials. No, it was in most cases unofficial. It was unofficial.
I have a question, probably not being included in your presentation, but I'm wondering if you came across any pictures in your research that was not about removing a person's figures, but about adding an unexisting figures into a photo.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you can find such photographs in David King's book, The Commissar Vanishes.
Excuse me.
With the first book.
Yeah.
That you showed up here.
Yeah. There are a couple of examples of photos like this in his book. And again, adding a person is technically difficult, and it can be made only by a professional editor, like a newspaper editor, a visual artist, and a professional photographer. So, but I was interested in family photographs, in private photographs, and it was not, of course, easy to add a person. So no, I never came across such photographs when I was doing research.
I'm just trying to add some point to what she said. In China,
Mhm.
certainly they did that for Lin Biao, the notorious Lin Biao who tried to defect to Soviet Union in
1971,
1971. Yes,
September.
but before that, he was Mao's successor.
Mhm.
And then the top leadership photos since the 50s without him, because he was not. So after he was named as the Mao's successor, the People's Daily, because the newspaper could do that,
Mhm.
so that inserted him into this photo with other leaders. So China certainly did that during the Cultural Revolution. And then, ironically, he defected. He tried to have a coup to against Mao, and then attempted to flew to Soviet Union and crashed in Hong. So certainly China had that case. It's adding somewhat. I think you were mentioning.
And as Denise mentioned, there are examples of that in that book that King mentioned. But those deal with exactly as you mentioned, with official forums that can have highly skilled editors. Whereas Denise is focusing on the family photographs where people, it would be hard again. It maybe nowadays because digital photography is so ubiquitous. It's hard to remember that back then cameras were fairly primitive, film was fairly primitive, and editing was hard. So except through scratching or cutting out.
My question would relate more to the research methodology that you use. How did you envision this research at the beginning, and if how did you go step by step? How did you find these photographs in family archives? So, and what were the difficulties that we faced with that?
Good questions.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It took me more than 10 years to collect all these photos, and it was not easy to find them. And most of photographs published in the book come from museums. They are not from private collections because it's very difficult to deal with people who own such photographs. They don't want to have it published. They tell you, yeah, I have such photos in my family album. And when you ask the person, can I have a look? In 100% of cases, they tell you, unfortunately, I can't find this album. It's somewhere in my grandmother's house and so on. So they find different kind of pretexts for not sharing these photos with you, because they feel that there is something wrong with these photos. So your grandmother removed your grandfather from the photo. There is something wrong. There is a skeleton in the closet, Yeah, it's people don't want to share these photos. But on the other
Thanks. Might be related to the true feeling of the relative or friend. And I understand that. But I'm wondering if there's another scale. another calculation, and that was the likelihood of being discovered. If you care deeply for your father, you might want to preserve it. On the other hand, you feel that there's a high probability that you will be investigated and that the photo will be found. And then in order to protect myself and loved ones, regardless of my feelings, I have to black it out. And I wonder if that's relevant to your research analysis.
Yeah, I think it worked exactly as you described. Yeah, it was a moral dilemma for the family members of the arrested person. So, and it was up to them. Everybody had to make a decision. So you had to choose between your security and your good faith. So it was very tragic. And children of those arrested as enemy of the people, they felt very guilty. During the post-Stalinist period, this feeling of guilt was very powerful.
When for 1956 on, so did they? What did they do to that?
It's a good question. And some of them tried to find information about the arrested parents. Some of them tried to find their graves or to install some memorial signs on the place of their burial, but it's very difficult to find graves. It's one of the biggest problems that we have now, because to fight Stalinism and to deal with Stalinism, you need to do this work of identification of the bodies, and it's impossible in case of.
I'm thinking about the movement that was formed in Russia. I remember it's quite a while ago, and it was co-opted by the Putin administration for some purposes, but it's called the Avoided Regiments. So has there ever been an effort among those whose family members fell victim to the Great Terror, to Stalinist terror in general, to form some sort of movement that would commemorate them?
Yeah, indeed, the Immortal Regiment started as alternative to the appropriation of the World War II by the Russian state. So this initiative was started by 4 journalists based in the city of Tomsk. What they wanted was exactly to find another way of commemorating the victims' memory. An unofficial way of commemorating of those who took part in World War II, of those who were killed during World War II. But of course, the initiative was really seized from them, appropriated by the Russian state, and actually currently the Immortal Regiment is almost totally controlled by the president's administration. Is controlled from the bottom, unfortunately.
With the Stalinist terror, though, I'm thinking, was there an effort when the rehabilitations began in 1956 and then didn't get all that far, but then there was another effort starting in the Gorbachev period in the 1990s to rehabilitate. Now, a lot of the relatives were dead by that point, but not all. So were some efforts made then to take out these photographs or to find photographs that actually showed the.
It's indeed many the generation of people whose parents were killed during Stalin. This generation has passed away. So now
So let me just one last point, if I could, is Denise and I, a little bit later, I think at 3 p.m., we'll be having a Zoom meeting with a woman from Vancouver who saw the listing for this seminar, and we got very excited about it because she has a collection of her family photographs, and from this period. I think that some of them have these where people were removed from. So have you, since your book came out, have you been approached by others who want to offer their photographs to you? No. That itself is interesting. Okay, so unless there are any other comments or questions, let me add, please take food if you would like it over here at the lunch. And let me, though, first of all, thank Denise Scopin for an excellent presentation, and thank you everyone for coming.